What I want to talk about now is, when are things going to change? When are things going to turn around? When are we going to start solving the horrible multicultural problems that we're experiencing? Because there's no shortage of people saying it's all going to kick off in a year's time, it'll all change. This can't go on for more than a year. I guarantee it. Loads of people saying that. Go onto YouTube, go onto Twitter, go onto Facebook, you'll find people saying that. No, wrong answer. It's going to take a lot longer than that. It won't happen in 6 months. It won't happen in a year. And that is a shame, because what we're seeing is nothing but bad news. Propaganda, cultural destruction and degradation. The English of all people, being denied status as an independent, indigenous people. Mass migration, BLM, happy Ramadan, criminalised speech and the pinching out of activists. And what is most depressing is the bulk of ordinary people simply going along with it, the apathy, the willingness to knuckle under and accept it. Now, what I want to talk about is why this is happening. In brief, I'll summarise what I want to say. This is happening because people are going along with it. People are going along with it because the system appears to be working. The system appears to be working because the economy is still surviving. The economy is not showing signs of breaking down. The economy is not showing signs of breaking down because the debt bubble is still stable. It is not bursting. And the reason the debt bubble hasn't burst is because inflation has not increased. And if inflation increases, then interest rates will go up. But until then, the debt bubble is survivable. The system survives, and people will go along with things the way they are. And people are then, as long as people are prepared to go along with it, what is happening will continue to happen. That is why it is happening. What is happening because politicians are doing it. Politicians are doing it for two reasons. Firstly, the main reason from their own selfish perspective is that it gives them more power by making us more manageable, by making us easier to rule, by taking away our sense of identity, by grinding us down. Multiculturalism, mass migration, BLM, the whole multicultural propaganda project, it is very good for grinding people down, denying them a sense of identity. Your average wife beater understands that. Take away a sense of identity, grind her down, she'll become more dependent and not less. Politicians want that. That gives them more power. It's not just about the amount of power they have, it's also about the weakness of the people, us, that they rule over. And the second reason that politicians are doing it is simply because we are letting them do it. We're going along with it. We are assenting to it, permitting them to do it. It is baleful, but that is a fact. There's a lot of apathy about that. We're grumbling about it, but we are going along with it. So the next question is, why are we going along with it? Why are the bulk of ordinary people going along with it? The reason is because people put individual survival before the survival of civilization. People care about themselves first, then about those who are nearest and dearest to them, their families, their close friends, and then finally about people in society who are like them, people they can identify with, people who think, act, speak, and even look like them. This is probably a Darwinian trait, to focus on your own survival first and to focus on the survival of civilization afterwards. Perhaps it's better that way. I don't say that people are just a bunch of materialistic, apathetic morons. It's simply, this is the way that we are made. Maybe it's better that way. I think I would rather live that way than live amongst a society that's composed entirely of woke activists. Now, people are going along with this because the system appears to be working, particularly employment and the economy and the welfare state. Survival in the big state welfare state depends upon the welfare state. Healthcare, roads, social insurances, welfare payments, housing benefit, schools, policing, all the things, old age care, all the pensions, everything that the state provides, these things become necessities for survival. So as long as the welfare state and the management of the economy appears to be staggering along, we will go along with the system as it is. This is the deal that we have with the system. As long as it works moderately well, we will grumble, but we will accept it. The question then is, when are people going to stop going along with this? And the answer to that is simply when the system stops working, when the deal between people and government breaks down, when government is no longer able to provide the welfare, or when the welfare that it does provide can't afford to feed you, when all these benefits, pensions, dole money, housing benefit, schooling, hospitals, when hospitals close their doors, then people are going to say, we have let you, government, MPs, politicians, lord it over us. You haven't kept your side of the bargain. We're not accepting the deal any longer. But until that happens, we are in a historically unique situation, a situation that is unique since we crawled out of a puddle. And that is this a situation where there is a widespread belief that the state can, should, and will take care of us. No, it can't do, but we believe it can, and that is just unprecedented. So we will go along with the system as long as that continues. When the state no longer provides for us and we realise it's just not going to do that, then we will scrap that deal with the state. We will break that contract with the state because the state has already broken its side of the bargain. And so the next question is, when will that happen? When will the system stop working? And that is when the economy breaks down, when money stops coming out of the wall, when hospitals close, when the dole check or the housing benefit check stops landing on the mat, stops landing in your account, or when your job with the local authority goes, or when the government is no longer able to manage the economy well enough that you feel your job is guaranteed. If suddenly you're made redundant and the government can't do anything about it, it doesn't pay you any dole money, that is when the system stops working. And then people will no longer go along with that. So the question is then, when will the economy break down? When will that happen? That will happen when the economy breaks down. The economy is likely to break down when interest rates rise. The reason why interest rates will be fatal to the economy is because of the levels of debt within the economy. Debt has been allowed to percolate, has been stuffed into every corner of the economy. Corporate debt, companies borrowing money at very low interest rates in order to fund projects that are not very profitable. Housing debt, people borrowing money, taking on mortgages at low interest rates in order to pump up the price of housing. So we see a housing crisis as a result of that. Buy-to-let landlords able to take on more mortgages, to buy up more houses, to let them out to people. Government debt, governments borrowing money at very low interest rates. Margin debt, where investors borrow money in order to buy shares. This has happened since, well, the last 2 decades at least, but certainly since 2008. The financial crisis in 2008 led governments to respond to it by lending money at low interest to banks or central banks lending money at low interest to governments and to banks, in order that banks will then lend it to business people so that they can fund projects to try and create economic activity, to keep people employed, to try and create a little bit of an economic boom. Now, the result of that, central banks around the world, the Federal Reserve in America particularly, but also the Bank of England and the European Central Bank, printing money, lending it into the economy, that has allowed debt at low interest rates to go right through it into every corner of the economy. So companies who should go broke have found that they can prolong their survival by taking on big debts, which normally they wouldn't be able to take on. But because the interest rate is so low, those debts look really bad on their balance sheet, but their profit and loss looks okay because they don't have to pay much each year in interest to roll that debt over. And as a result, businesses have taken on debts that they should not have taken on, and which they cannot survive if the interest rates go up. And so the next question is, when will that debt bubble burst? Well, that's when interest rates rise. Interest rates will rise when inflation rises, if inflation kicks up. Now, there have been a lot of people since 2008, you can go on YouTube and find them, without missing a beat, they have said continuously for the last 13 years, inflation is going to kick up in the next few months. It hasn't. Inflation has continued to decline, to go down and down and down. We've seen deflation. We've seen inflation in asset prices. There you've seen a lot of inflation. Housing prices, share prices, the prices of government bonds or the prices of some commodities. Those have risen and risen. But what the inflation, the consumer price inflation, the prices of goods in the shops, food and other goods that you buy in the shops, those have not gone up. We have not seen inflation in that, not the inflation that has been predicted. And the reason for that, or the question then is, when is inflation likely to go up? It's not simply a question of saying inflation will go up someday. It's about the timing, and that is the crux of the matter, because if you can time that, you can time when all the other social changes that we want to see will happen. Now, I think that inflation is likely to rise again in about 5 or 6 years' time, say about 5 years' time. Now, what I should say is you should take any predictions like this, predictions on timing, with a big pinch of salt. And the more certain someone is about their predictions, the more likely they are to be wrong, the more likely they are to be just lying, just making it up. So always hedge against someone being dogmatic. What I think we're going to see, well, the reason I say that is because so many people have been saying, no, we're going to see inflation kicking up in the next few months, and it hasn't happened. What has happened, what you've seen in since 2008, is central banks, particularly the Federal Reserve, not printing money and spending it, but printing money and lending it. That has been the model. They're not allowed, they're supposed not to print and spend. They are allowed to print and lend. So let's say the Bank of England or the Federal Reserve, they print up money and they then lend it to big banks who lend it to businesses in the economy. Or they print up money and they lend it to central government, who then spend that money into the economy. That's the model. It's about lending money. And the problem with that, a lot of people have predicted, well, that's creating more money. It's increasing the money supply. That's going to create inflation. The opposite has happened. It has created deflation. And the reason is that, well, the reason appears to be that when that money gets lent into the economy, it creates a short-term boost to the economy, but pretty soon, when it wears off, what those businesses, what the economy is left with, is a debt overhang. And that debt overhang is a burden that depresses economic activity, that reduces inflation, that creates deflation, and then in turn that reduces interest rates. That's not my explanation. That's the explanation that I like from an investment analyst called Lacey Hunt, somebody who's very good, an American investment analyst, an economic analyst who I think has got it right. The reason I like that analysis is, first of all, it has been right since 2008. When everyone in 2008 was saying that government money printing and lending was going to create inflation, he said, no, it will create deflation. And that is what has happened. The other reason I like that explanation is because I think it's practical. It's consistent with practical common sense. Instead of thinking of government lending or government borrowing and spending into the economy, just think of it in terms of your own credit card. Let's say your family is in the doldrums. You're all a bit depressed. You're feeling bad. You're feeling cranky. You're getting at each other. You're a bit unhappy in your family. And I come along to you and say, well, I'll lend you 10 grand and you can spend it on what you like. Spend it on the holiday of a lifetime and have a couple of really big parties. You'll feel great. And that will promote really good activity for you for a little while. When that's over, what you're left with is that 10 grand debt overhang. And you have to pay interest on that. Even if it's a low interest rate, you have to pay interest, and you have that debt hanging over you, just sitting like a debt, sitting as a debt on your shoulders. And that will put your family in a worse position than it was if I'd never lent that 10 grand to you. It would leave you even more depressed than you were before. And there's another reason, which is what's called the marginal utility of debt, that if you lend money to a business, the same as if you lend it to a family, that business will get an awful lot of activity about it at first. They will pick the things that they really wanted to do for a long time and haven't quite been able to afford to do, the things that are profitable, the things that really create activity. But each time you lend more money to them, that business will start doing things that don't create so much activity, don't create so much profit. That's called the marginal utility of debt. And each time the utility, what you can get out of that debt, what you can do with it, will go down. What appears to be the case, what economists that I read are saying, is that for every dollar that's now getting lent into the economy, there appear to be businesses who borrow that money. If a dollar is lent into the economy, it appears to create less than $1 worth of activity, about 85 cents worth. But businesses will take that on because no one's worrying about the amount of debt. People are simply saying interest rates are low, that business can afford it. It can keep paying 1% interest, 2% interest, 2% in interest every year. And as a result of that, all that money that is getting lent into the economy, it is creating deflation and reducing interest rates. And that is what has happened since about 2008. The question then is, how long will that go on? Well, that will go on until the point when central banks can't lend any more money to central governments. They can't lend any more money into the economy. They have to move from a model of printing and lending to printing and spending. That's sometimes referred to as helicopter money or spraying confetti money, where the central bank just prints up the money and goes and hands it to people, puts it in your bank account without lending it via a bank or via central government. That is not happening then, but the question is, when is that likely to change? When will central governments go from printing and lending to printing and spending? My answer to that is I think that is going to come in about 5 years' time. What I want to refer to here, this is the nerdy bit, this is where I refer to charts, but I'm trying to analyse, I'm trying to look at economic conditions to see when this is likely to change, because I think a lot hinges on this. That is the crux of it, when central banks start printing and spending. I think that will happen in about 5 years' time. The reason I think that is really two main reasons. Firstly, because I want to refer to a lesson from history about the size of government deficits. The other thing I want to do is refer to the government, American government lending and also the Federal Reserve balance sheet. The reason I'm focusing on America is because the dollar is the reserve currency throughout the world. So much of the world economy depends on and is geared to the dollar, the American economy. That is central. When that changes, the world economy, our own economies, will change. So when the Federal Reserve starts printing and spending, we will have to do the same. So what I want to refer to first is the lesson from history, and that is, the lesson from history is that things change. Governments have to start just printing money and spending it when their year-by-year deficit reaches 20% of GDP. It doesn't seem to matter that much the size of the debt. What matters is how much they're adding to the debt every year. And the rule appears to be that when governments have a deficit each year of 20% of GDP, that's when society becomes ungovernable. Now, what I want to refer to here, first of all, is this book that's called The War That Never Was by a man called David Price Jones. Now, in it, he interviews various people who were around at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, which at the time everyone said was never going to collapse. And in that book, in this book, he interviews a Soviet economist who went to Gorbachev and said, "You've got to liberalize the economy." Gorbachev just couldn't bring himself to do it because Gorbachev was a bit thick. And this economist, his name was Vasily Selyunin, he realized the Soviet Union is going to collapse. All I can do is let it collapse, and I will try and document it so that people can learn from it. And Vasily Selyunin is distinguished by the fact that you've never heard of him, you will never hear of him again, and this is history. No one listens, no one learns, the same old mistakes keep getting repeated. But what he said in that book, when he was interviewed, what he said was that the Soviet Union, printed money. Investment here was done entirely by the state through the budget. That is why we had a budget deficit of more than 20%. So what he means is the Soviet Union's annual yearly budget deficit reached 20% of GDP. And he said, if you look at the point where military coups are carried out in Latin America, you will find they coincide with a budget deficit of 20%. So he looked at other countries to find what the common factors are. He found that 20% deficit, a central government having an annual deficit of 20% of GDP. And he said that is when a country becomes ungovernable. Now that also seems to be the lesson of another book which I want to look at, and that is this book. That is by a man called Peter Bernholz, and that is Monetary Regimes and Inflation, History, Economic and Political Relationships by Peter Bernholz. What that book is about is looking at the inflations of the Central European inflations of the 20th century. And what he found there is, well, at chapter 5, which is stated quite clearly, hyperinflations are caused by government budget deficits. He said in this section it will be demonstrated by looking at 12 hyperinflations that they have all been caused by the financing of huge public budget deficits through money creation. The figures demonstrate clearly that deficits amounting to 40% or more of expenditures cannot be maintained. So what he means is when a government deficit is 40% of its tax take, you can't go beyond it. It's going to break down after that. They lead to high and hyperinflations. Now I think that's about the same as saying a deficit of 20% of GDP. The reason is because in general the ceiling for tax take is about 50% of GDP. That's about the most that a government can squeeze out in tax take. So if you're saying that the government's annual deficit is 40% of the tax take, you're effectively saying it's about 20% of GDP. So the evidence from European hyperinflations and from the collapse of the Soviet Union and from the collapse of military coups and collapses that took place in 1980s and 1990s Latin America, the evidence is that when government debt reaches, or government deficits, year by year deficits, reach 20% of GDP, that is when society becomes ungovernable. That is when central banks simply have to print the money just for government to be able to stagger along a bit longer. Now, the question is, when is that likely to happen? When will the Federal Reserve hit that point? I think in America 20% is too low a limit. I think it's likely to be nearer to 30% in America for two reasons. Firstly, people have confidence in the dollar. People have confidence in the American economy. It appears to be the economy that the world is relying on for what's such stability as there is. Secondly, America is moving very fast towards becoming a big state welfare state. That means a lot of people have a very strong incentive to believe that the American state can survive, that the American economy, that the American government management of the economy can last a lot longer. People want to believe that, and so people will believe that because they want to. So I don't think it will be, I don't think the ceiling will be 20% or deficits of 20% of GDP. I think it's likely to be nearer 30% of GDP. annual deficits in America have already nearly hit 20%. So I think it'll go higher than that. What's the state of current annual deficits in America? Well, I want to show you this this curve. If you look at that, what that is the end of quarter three, the third quarter in 2019, going to the end of the third quarter in 2020. Now, what you see there is that it went from about down the bottom. It went from about 22.5 trillion up to about 26, nearly 27 trillion. So the annual deficit in America for that year, from September 2019 to September 2020, was 4.2 trillion. Now the GDP in America, if you can see that chart, is about 21.43 trillion US dollars. Now, so 4.2 is about 19% of 21.5 trillion. So it's pretty close to 20% already. If that continues, that is quickly going to hit the wall for America. Now the question is, when is it going to hit the wall? When will central banks, when will the Federal Reserve no longer be able to lend money to the American government? When will it have to simply print money and spend it into the economy? Well, what I want to look at now is that depends on the level of public debt in America. Now, that curve, if you see that curve, that is the level of government debt, the rising level of government debt, going from about 1970 up to about 2020. And that is very much like an exponential curve. And it's going up to about nearly $28 trillion from almost zero in 1970. And it matches, if what I've done there is to show it in terms of the blue curve is the federal the federal debt, and the red curve I've overlaid it with, that is your standard mathematical exponential curve. And what that appears to show is that that exponential curve goes vertical, I would say somewhere around 2026. Now that is the point, I think, at which the Federal Reserve can no longer simply lend to the American government, because the American government's debts will be so high they won't be able to borrow anymore. They will, the central bank, the American central bank, will simply have to print money and spend it into the economy. And the reason for that is the American central government will go to the American central bank and say, we can't borrow any more money from you. If our debts go any higher, if our deficit goes any higher this year, everyone else we've borrowed money from will pull the plug. Interest rates will rise, and we can't afford that. So we can't afford to borrow money from you, but we need you to get money into the economy. So the central bank will effectively order the American government will simply order the Federal Reserve to print money and spend it into the economy. And that is when inflation starts to rise. I think that chart shows that's likely to happen at about 2026. Now I want to look at another curve, and that is the curve of the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet, it basically accounts for how much money the Federal Reserve, the central bank, has put out into the economy. Now if I show you that chart, what you see there, if I can get it right, that is the amount of money that the Federal Reserve has put into the economy. Again, the blue line, that's what the Federal Reserve, the amounts of money they put into the economy. I've put a nice smooth exponential curve there. Again, what you see on that side is that it eventually goes vertical. That curve goes vertical at around 2026, I reckon. So at that stage, what it looks like is the amount of money that the Federal Reserve has to put into the economy becomes infinite or unlimited in another 5 years' time. And you can't lend unlimited amounts of money, but you can spend unlimited amounts of money if you have a printing press. And so that's why I think that threshold of central governments having to borrow, having a deficit of about 30% of GDP, I think that is likely to be hit in another 5 years' time. It's going to take us 5 years to reach that point. Now, when that does happen, then I think you are going to see interest rates rising fast. Because when money gets printed and just spent into the economy, it creates inflation. You don't have any debt overhang. You suddenly get all this money going into the economy and people can spend it like there's no tomorrow. And then that creates accelerating activity. And people respond to that because they see a bit of inflation and they say to themselves, I will now start spending my money in order to get rid of it because it will be worth less next year. So I'll spend it now. And that creates more inflation. That inflation snowballs. When central banks move from printing and lending to printing and spending, inflation kicks in fast. I think that will happen fast in another 5 or 6 years' time. Now, there are already hints of that happening. It's happened, the Bank of England in April 2019 printed up $500 billion and just handed it supposedly as a temporary measure to the British government. It wasn't as a debt, it was just handed over. Now, that wasn't reported on much, it hasn't been repeated. That's a hint of I think that's a hint of what's likely to come. That was not a temporary measure, even though it was called that. Government temporary measures, well, there is nothing so permanent as a temporary government plan, a temporary government measure. Secondly, what we're seeing now is, what we saw in 2008 was central government or central banks printing money and then lending it to banks who then lent it to businesses in the hopes of creating more business activity that would employ more people, that would create more economic activity. And that was done, it was done via lending institutions. That was unpopular. People don't like seeing bankers getting bailed out. So the bailouts that are happening now are not so much towards the bank, well, they are towards the banks, but also handing out money to the population. That's not central banks printing money and just giving it to people. That's central banks printing money, lending it to central government, who then hand it to people. We saw that during the COVID crisis. Money had to be got into the economy. I don't think the COVID crisis was the central fact. I think it was just a catalyst for what governments were having to do anyway, just to keep up with that exponential need for money printing. But that money got printed by the central banks, handed to central government, and then central government handed it to individuals to supplement their wages, to pay them for being off work. We've seen it with Biden's recent plan, his $1.9 trillion plan that he announced as soon as he got elected. That's $1,400 to everyone, I think, earning less than $75,000 a year. Trump wanted to do more than that. He didn't want to give out $1,400 to people. He wanted to give out $2,000 to people. Now, the significance of that is not happening via a lending institution. That is money just getting handed out to people via the government who borrow it. But that is a little bit closer to the model of central banks printing money and spending it. They're not doing that yet, but it's a hint that that is going to happen. When that happens, when government deficits get so high that they can't borrow anymore, then they will go to central banks saying, print the money and just spray it into the economy, helicopter money. And then you will see inflation kick up fast. I think that is likely to start in about 5 years' time. Inflation will rise and keep rising. That will burst the debt bubble. That in turn will cause the economy to break down. That will mean that systems stop working. The system stops working, that government will have to break its deal to people. The expectation people have that the state can, should and will take care of you, that will break down. Government will break its side of the bargain and ordinary people will say, right, you broke that bargain. We no longer vote for you, we no longer accept to be ruled by you, we no longer accept to be governed by you. At that point, the system will break down. At that point, people will stop going along with it. They will stop going along with the PC nonsense, the repression, the propaganda, BLM, Happy Ramadan, the degradation of our own cultures. Society may break down, but at that point, people will then realise that civilization is necessary for their survival, that the state was no substitute for civilization in order to preserve their own survival. That is how civilizations arise, in order to protect and preserve people's survival collectively. And at that point, you will see a massive change in attitudes, because people will have to rely upon themselves for their own survival. They will have to rely upon collectivizing with other people like them. When people collectivize for their own survival, they do it. They are only prepared to rely on people who act, speak, think, and even look like them. People they can identify with, and people identify with people who are like them. And at that point, I think you will see people a very fast and profound shift in attitudes. I would liken it to an earthquake followed by a landslide in public attitudes. The whole PC nonsense, the multicultural rubbish, the propaganda, all the repression that we're getting out, that will go out of the window. Attitudes will change fast. I think that is likely to happen at the end of this decade. What I've tried to pinpoint here is when the beginnings of the change, the economic change, will come. The political and social attitudes will come after that. We'll probably lag that by a couple of years. So I think we're looking at another 5 years for the economic change to come. And then a couple of years after that, we'll get the political and then the social change. So at the end of this decade. So what that means for you, what that means for us, is that we have at least another 5 years of the same old grind, the same old PC paralysis, the same old degradation, destruction of our own culture, the same denial of our status as English people, mass migration and ethnic minorities stamping their feet and rioting and demanding more rights, and you and I having our free speech rights pinched out. That is likely to continue. We have to be patient. We have to continue with that. It is no good if you simply want to lose your temper, that you can see people, I don't have to name them, go onto YouTube, lose their temper, shout and rant and rave and say everything's going to kick off immediately, and by the way, send me money. Those people are no good. If you can't hold your temper for the next few years, you're no use. There's no harm if you're taken out of the game. It doesn't much matter, because you are of no benefit. What you need to do, what we need to do, is to be patient and steadfast and to hold the line. You can, if you want to do something, my recommendation is do something that means you are not tainted with the treachery of the political class who rule us. The best thing I think you can do is to help to fund me to stop mosques from getting planning permission. That is a way to hold the line. You will feel better. You will stop feeling so short-tempered about the situation, so frustrated, if you know you're at least doing something and you are no longer tainted with the apathy and treachery that you see going on around you. But you need to find a way to hold your temper for at least another 5 years. Then I think things are going to start to change economically, and then after that things will change socially, and fast. Attitudes will change profoundly then. In the meantime, everything is preparation for that. This is not a particularly encouraging message. It's not a nice message. I would like to say, yes, things are about to change. Don't worry, it's all going to happen in the next 6 months, the next year. I don't think it will, but I think we are better facing reality squarely and holding the line in preparation for when things change, when we can do something. Then it will count. Thank you.